Hello everybody and welcome to my review of Wartile. Now Wartile is a recently released Steam game that was previously in early access, developed by Playwood Project and published by Deck 13 and Whisper Games. Wartile describes itself as a cooldown based strategy game set in a Viking themed universe with Norse mythology and a board game aesthetic. Sounds pretty nifty, but what does it mean by a cooldown based strategy game? Well, Wartile's board game aesthetic and hex-based grid would lead you to believe it's a turn-based strategy game where you perform some actions, end your turn, and then see the game react. But that's not the case. Wartile is fully real-time. Everything on the board can move at the same time, and you cannot pause the game to give orders. So before we get too deep into the mechanics, let's back up a bit to the campaign. Wartile is a strictly single-player experience revolving around a preset campaign. There are no custom games or scenarios, everything takes place in the campaign. The campaign room is your hub for your figurines, your cards, and choosing your next board. There are 7 boards in total, each with their own unique scenario, and 4 of these have a second scenario. This means you'll be playing on the same board, but it might look slightly different, and you'll have different enemies and objectives. Each scenario will then have 3 difficulty levels that will unlock as you progress through the game and earn a higher reputation level. This means there's a total of 33 missions across 11 unique scenarios across 7 boards, so there's a decent amount of content to get through in the game. And they rotate around pretty well, so you're never really doing the same board twice in a row. Completing missions will grant you new gear, new boards, new figurines, and new cards, so you always get something new to equip or to try out, which makes doing each mission pretty rewarding. So I've mentioned figurines a couple of times now, and these are basically your playable characters. You start off with just 2, and you can unlock 4 more later on. Each figurine has a preset class, so there's a standard warrior, a tankish warrior, a brute that's a high damage dealer, a spearman that has a long range melee, an archer who is great at range, and a shaman who casts spells. Each figurine can be leveled up to level 5 and has a series of stats. Leveling up doesn't directly influence your stats, but each level grants you a token slot. Tokens will directly buff one of your stats, and once you bind it to a figurine, you can't unbind it without destroying it. Luckily, you'll find a lot of random tokens during your missions, and some rare ones that have some special attributes. This allows you to decide how to upgrade your characters with a good degree of flexibility. If you feel your brute is dying too often, you can buff up his health or his defense if you've got the tokens for it. Each figurine also has 3 ability cards, and these also unlock as you level the figurine up. The cards are tied to the class of the figurine, so the archer will have specific ones like flaming arrows, while the spearman can form a spear wall. Now while each figurine has 3 of these, you can only choose 1 to take into the mission with you, and for me at least it wasn't always the highest level one. For instance, the spearman has a card called Immobilize, freezing an enemy in place, which is great if you don't have a ranged member in your party, so again there's nice flexibility with deciding what abilities you want for a given mission, and a steady progression of new ones to try out. The last thing you can upgrade is your figurine's gear. Again, this is class dependent, but some items can be used between different classes such as helmets and shoulder pads, but only an archer can use a bow, only a shaman can use a staff, etc. As you complete missions, you'll earn loot and gear for your characters and also gold. The gold can then be taken to the merchant who supplies random loot for you to purchase and equip. You can also sell equipment or tokens you don't need to get back some extra gold. It's fairly straightforward, but combined with all of the different ways to upgrade, it's actually a pretty fun, albeit simple RPG type system for leveling and earning gear. The final unlockable are the godly cards. Godly cards are global abilities that can range from unique environmental attacks, heal spells, buffs, and even spawning in temporary figurines. These cards are unlocked by completing certain missions, and there's 19 of them in total. You can choose 5 to take to a mission, and they'll be randomized into a pool of 3. Using one costs a certain amount of battle points that relates to its strength, so it's typically good to take a range of strong spells and weaker buffs. They'll definitely turn the tide of a fight in your favor. Once you've selected all of your equipment, then it's up to you which mission you do. There's sort of a loose story with each mission, but generally speaking, it doesn't really tie together, and it's more like independent scenarios with a bit of a parable of mythology tied into them. On the start of a scenario, you'll receive some objective cards. Now you don't actually do anything with these, but they just fit the aesthetic and serve as a reminder of what to do. On completion of these objectives, the board game will end and you'll be given a score based on your performance and a summary of your loot. You rarely have to kill all enemies, but your score will increase if you do so. The objectives across the different maps were pretty fun, and each one felt quite diverse. There were missions to rescue someone by sneaking around killing people in their sleep, Others asked you to destroy towers by burning them down. Some focused on mythology with sacrificing a goat or collecting an object for one part of the map and transporting it to another. My favorite was a wave-based defense map where as each wave came in, you could take a moment for a breather or activate the next wave immediately for more battle points to potentially give you more uses for abilities. It was a really cool back and forth kind of power dynamic. So as mentioned, the game is cooldown based. This means that when you move a figurine, they can't move again for another 2 seconds or so. This is indicated by the white bar around them slowly collapsing in until they can move again. For the most part, the UI is very clear about when and where you can move, and it'll let you know if you can't with your figurine kind of grunting on the spot. Some scenarios will see you moving 4 figurines around, so each of them having 2 seconds of cooldown and abilities can mean it gets pretty hectic when you're moving around in a fight with 5 or 6 other enemies. You can slow the game down if you want to make some snap decisions though. Melee fighting automatically occurs when 2 figurines are on hexes next to each other. There are height differences and flanking bonuses as well as line of sight issues to take into account, so positioning is very important. You can maneuver while in combat, so surrounding enemies is the best way to cut them down fast. Certain figurines add a bit more tactical depth, such as the spearman. He can reach across 2 tiles to attack, so a good way to position him is to have him behind 2 melee figurines so he can jab at the enemy between his allies. If the enemy closes the gap to him, he can just hop back a few steps and continue attacking at range. Similarly, the archer has a great range of 5 or so tiles, but needs a height advantage or a clear line of sight to fire. And with the layouts of the board and placement of enemies, you can get funneled down tight areas that make combat very awkward if you have a large party. On top of all of this, there's the stats to consider. They may be quite simple, but there's basically an attack and defense skill stat to determine if they'll hit each other or not, a damage and armor stat to see how much damage is done when they do get hit, and then an overall health to see how long a figurine will live. So while each of the mechanics on their own are quite simple, it quickly combines to get pretty busy when you take the terrain into account and the weapon types, not forgetting the ability cards of each figurine and the global godly cards that rotate on use. The game, as mentioned, is built for single player, so you're not strictly against an opponent. The enemy don't have cards that they use, and they just act as independent figurines you have to clear off the board. The AI of the figurines do a good job of playing to their strengths, such as falling back with spearmen or archers, and using its ability to knock you back a tile or freeze you in place when it makes sense to do so. The game can get quite challenging towards the end, but there are board checkpoints you can use mid-game, so you don't have to do a full restart each time you die or lose a figurine. Now, losing a figurine is only temporary to the board. You don't need it to finish the scenario, and you'll have it back out on the campaign. One of the issues I have with the missions is that when you finish a scenario, it'll give you a score, but without any leaderboards or a rating system, I have no way of telling if I did good or not. On a couple of occasions, I just hopped around the enemies and made it out with the last figurine I had alive, and had no incentive to go back and try again. I think doing it in a time frame or in a certain amount of moves would be a good way to introduce a kind of gold, silver, bronze system and enhance the replayability for those who want a perfect run or to get achievements. Unfortunately, though it is fun to play, once you've done a mission, I really had no reason to go back and try again. The game's aesthetic is arguably its biggest draw for most people. The board looks as though it has been carved out of solid wood blocks and then painstakingly painted with deep chunky hexagons individually placed inside the playable area. The lifting off of individual rooftops and placement of cards on the board really do make it feel as though you're sitting around a table reacting to your dungeon master's layouts and traps. The sound of matted wood figurines tapping off the boards and the faint weather effects really blur the line between reality of the board and the imagination of the world inside it. Weather effects and tile effects are brilliantly done, with lightning bolts snapping down on tiles with ferocious power and a clear UI that lets you know when environmental hazards are impeding a tile. Even the tutorial places itself inside the board for you to read as a sort of rule set in-game. My only issues was that from time to time animations wouldn't correctly play to match the action that's being carried out. Usually when too much is affecting one figurine in particular, they kind of just freeze up on the spot. The stats and everything under the hood still played out though. Back on the campaign, the same theme is kept, with wooden maps and figurines and a card deck you can rotate and search through. The Viking theme is prominent throughout, with a little Viking ship you get on before selecting your mission, a tavern for finding new figurines, and all the backstories and Norse lore throughout the game. Now, despite its beautiful art style, and perhaps because of it, Wartile feels like a lost opportunity. The game we're presented with is very good, and I commend the developers for trying something new by abandoning the turn-based strategy so heavily associated with board games and attempting to bridge the gap between a real-time video game and a board game. However, it seems with the base mechanics in the game, the heavy focus on positioning, careful use of abilities, the character customization, and the beautiful tabletop aesthetic, the game feels like it's screaming out for a turn-based tactics game where you make your own party, choose your own cards, and take it into battle. This type of game could also benefit from a multiplayer scene, which would be much easier to manage than a real-time game for a small developer such as Playwood Project. Wartile feels like a tease for what Playwood is capable of. As I said, the game is very good and unique. I've certainly never played anything like it, but without any multiplayer, a custom scenario mode, or something like leaderboards or scenario ratings, I've really no reason to go back to the game. That's all for my review of Wartile. If you want to catch one of my scenarios and see how the game plays, check out my uncut gameplay video which will show you what the moment-to-moment gameplay and combat is like. Remember, if you liked the video, please leave a like and consider supporting on Patreon. These reviews are primarily funded by amazing people over there and they just wouldn't be possible otherwise. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.